Hello, today's video is a review and it's about an ExpresLRS product. But just before we got there, I want to do a quick trip down memory lane to find out how far we've come in such a small time. Because if I think back to when I started flying, things have moved on so much. Now, I started flying with an old FlySky radio. I bought it for about £17. It came with a receiver. I didn't keep it very long. I've actually still got it, but it's so buried in a cupboard that I didn't want to get it out and say, look, here it is. But I upgraded quite quickly to this. This is Turner G9X, and one of the things I put in this was this. This is the FreeSky DJT module, and this would give me access to proper FreeSky receivers. And this is way before the X. We were dealing with the D8 style receivers, which now seem to be cut off. But and the reason that was such an upgrade is the FlySky stuff didn't have any telemetry, so I'd just fly along and suddenly it would just fall out of the sky. And then FreeSky came along with this amazing module and went beep when it was starting to get low, beep beep when it got lower, and beep 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 when it started to get critical, so you know when to turn around. That was amazing. And to put it into perspective about now, if I have a look at what I was flying, this is my tricopter. This is the first thing I ever flew and the first thing I built, and it was down to the fault of David Winstall and his videos that made me think I could, as someone who's never built anything before, fly it. It's still here in much the same as it was. It's had a couple of upgrades. It started with a KK, it's now got a KK2 in it, but we are looking at, you know, old 900 kV motors, ESCs that speak PWM, and this is the receiver, this quite large thing here, and it had 8 servo plugs in it, and it's got pretty large antennas either side. It's a big old beastie, and it's the videos of this thing flying are still on my channel if you go back to 2012 and have a look at it. And that was a pretty good system. You could put that in a plane, you could use antenna extensions to put them in the right place. You'd get about 3.5 kilometers before you ran out of telemetry, and you still get a control signal past that. But to go really far back in the olden days, you needed to go to a 433 system. I've got a couple here. This is the R-Link, this is the receiver for it, and a couple of the antennas. This is the thing you strap onto the back, and this plugs in via PPM. And this was so powerful it could suck a full battery out of Tyrannus in about a 30-minute flight. I also use this one. This is more popular at the time. This is a Dragon Link, or a V1, and this is the diamond antenna, which is big. And obviously the antennas on the receiver side were big because the wavelength for 433 is significantly longer than 2.4. So you're talking about big dipole antennas. Normally only you'd ever be flying planes through this. You would never fly a multi-rotor because the equipment was just too big. This wasn't a bad system by any means. It would get you serious range, and it still would. But the setup of them had to be right. You could put a 433 system in, have it very badly configured, and you'd get absolutely terrible range out of it. So they did take a little bit of expertise to get right. But from that we got various models of Tyrannus, and we had the very popular X series of receivers, especially things like the XM Plus, which worked really well in quads, because we're talking about these little stumpy antennas here, and you know, we could still fly a quad even though it's not, you know, brilliant about where we've placed stuff like a kilometre, and we're not dealing with a very high latency from the S-bus signal it would give. So that was a pretty good solution for us. But then TBS came along and they bought us Crossfire. Crossfire was quite an amazing thing. Working on the 915 and 868, much lower latency that you could really feel even if you weren't a racer. The antennas weren't too big. This is the transmitter one, and we've got a little micro receiver here, and you can see that the antenna for it is really quite small. So again, we're putting a system in place on a small multi-rotor where we don't have to give it too much thought about the antenna placement, and we'd get really low latency and we'd get a much higher range, which was pretty amazing. And this spawned some other 868 people, most famously R9 from FreeSky. There's one here on the back with the little micro module. Although at this point FreeSky was kind of falling a little bit out of favour. They were very popular up until this point, and then they started doing bad things, sort of making their hardware not work with TBS as well to try and further their own R9 stuff, and then coming out with a new version of ACCST which wouldn't work with the old receivers, and it felt like they were trying to lock people out of building any sort of copies, which really opened the way for products like Jumper and Radio Master to jump in and steal the thunder that FreeSky had. Amongst this time we started getting 2.4 versions of very low latency and high range systems. So we had the Ghost from IRC as one of them. TBS also brought out the Tracer, which is again a sort of 2.4 version of Crossfire. Low latency, high range. It seemed like a great time to be a modeler. There was a downside to any of that. It would be the fact that the receivers were only made by one company. So Immersion LC make the Ghost receivers and the modules, and TBS make the Crossfire and Tracer modules and receivers. So along comes ExpressLRS. So ExpressLRS is a fully open source hardware software solution that is seeking to use some of the sort of similar things as used in stuff like Crossfire, Ghost type of hardware. It uses hardware based on the Semtex SX127X and SX1280 chipsets combined with some other stuff, and this thing called LoRa modulation, which allows for them to develop the same low latency, high range stuff. And it's so similar to some of the other hardware out there that you can actually flash existing R9 Ghost modules and receivers and a few others with the code and get stuff from there. And I actually heard about this a while ago. People were talking about, hey, you can now flash on, because I've done a bunch of R9 videos, you can flash R9 with this new ExpressLRS stuff. And I always made a note, oh, I must go back and look at that at some point and check it out. And it's just very recently, what's also happened is this has sort of gone beyond just a few guys building their own PCBs and doing this stuff. It's got other people making the hardware and selling it. Now, some people might sort of like, oh, this is so bad. All the open source community aren't getting any kudos for doing this, and now people are commercializing it. This is a good thing. As soon as you've got multiple manufacturers building modules, building receivers, the price comes down. As a small community of hobbyists, what you can't do is manufacture to scale. It costs a lot to produce sort of single boards, even 100 boards. But big manufacturers can come along and do orders of thousands and 10,000s and whatever. And that sort of scale brings the price down. And that means as hobbyists, we're now able to get cheap modules and receivers with no hassles about them working with other manufacturers, with no hassle about how they plug into radios. It should be a great time for all. Now, that is a very convoluted story to say. I have some new hardware to test. Happy Model, I think, were the first commercial manufacturer of ExpressLRS hardware. I've now got some stuff from BetaFPV. BetaFPV are producing two types of module, one for the 868 and 900 market, another for the 2.4. I have the 868 one, and it looks like this. It's one of these, I forgot the name of it. It's the one that fits on the sort of more modern FreeSky radio, and I'm guessing some of the Jumpers and Radio Masters have these sort of interfaces as well. It's not the full JR style module. As I said, this is the 868. There's also a 2.4 module they produce. And what blew me away instantly was the size of the antenna, because 868 is not like huge, but if you look at the size of the receiver antenna, here's the what we've got. The receiver is very small. There's nothing new there, of course, because so are like Crossfire and everything else. But look at the size of this receiver antenna. It's absolutely tiddly. If I compare that to the Crossfire one, you will see there's quite a difference. It's absolutely tiny, unbelievably so. So I figured this has got to be a good thing, hasn't it? Because you're looking at an open source product where the price of entry is very cheap, the price of receivers is very cheap, the latency is very small, the range is very big, and you're even dealing with very small receivers. If this is the 868 version, the 2.4 must be even tinier. I just don't want to think about it. Anyway, let's get this out, and I'll show you in a bit more detail, and then we'll talk about what ExpressLRS does and how we set it up, which we're journey of discovery for me, because it's the first time I've messed with it, so I'm keen to see how well it works, how well you can do things, and that sort of stuff. Let's check it out. Okay, I just wanted to do a quick unboxing here to show you what we've got there, although I'm rethinking my life choices doing white on white here. But this is the module itself, and this is what you get. In here, you get the actual micro module, and there is a sort of rubber ducky antenna there, although you wouldn't really use that. It's got the connectors there. You'll see it's also got a USB-C connector there. I'm guessing that's for updates and stuff. I literally haven't read anything much about specifically how you do things. I just got the sort of gist of how ExpressLRS works and what you do with it. Let's pop that there. We've got the instructions. This is the Nano TX user module. It tells you some stuff about how to do setup and things. We've got a little support card from BetaFPV, and this is the reason you wouldn't be using that little rubber duck antenna. You've got a much nicer one in here, which is an 868 one. There is actually a specific, I'm glad to say, 868 one and a 915 one, because they are different wavelengths. So the 915 antenna would be slightly larger, and this is obviously going to give you better range of that. I don't know what sort of antenna this is. If I was looking at this in the olden days, I say this looks like a Moxon antenna. I don't know if this is directional or what. I will try and find out more as soon as I read the documentation. So that is your module on the receiver side, and don't forget this is the 868 version. 915 will be similar, but 2.4 will have a significantly smaller version of that, and smaller antennas on the receiver side as well. Just emptied that all out. You've got the Nano receiver user manual. It certainly is a Nano receiver. You've got the actual receiver there. You see you've got a receive, transmit, voltage and ground signal. You've got a little IPEX style antenna connector. Some sort of little button there, presumably for binding and things. There is, I think, a Wi-Fi chip on here so you can update over the air. That is the tiny 868 antenna that goes on. You've got a couple of heat shrinks because that is just bare at the moment until you solder it up. You can put little pin headers on if you want to, and you've got some nice flexible cable to go ahead and solder to that and your flight controller. In very basic terms, you would find a UART and you would go receive to transmit, transmit to receive, voltage to 5 volts, ground to ground, simple as that. Now, because I was sent 2 of these, even before I've learned anything about the setup, I decided to put one in place. Mostly because I'm also working on this for another project. This is an odd choice, I think you might say, to look at new cutting edge sort of hardware, because this is an old DJI 450. If you've watched my channel, you will know that I'm messing around with OpenHD. This is going to be an OpenHD platform. What I need to do first is make sure iNav is working. So I have just hooked this up as a new receiver, and you can see here that we've got a T1R1 5 volt ground, and I've just literally connected to that. So I thought, whilst I'm going through how to do things, I'll have this here and I can go through it as I go, essentially, and set it up. So that's what we're going to do next. We're going to set this up on a live system. Well, I say it's a live system. This hasn't actually flown yet with this configuration, but we'll get there and we'll test it out. So even before looking at the manual, just to find out a bit more about ExpressLRS, I went to the GitHub site, and a good thing here is they have some useful links. They've got a community Discord, a Facebook group, a wiki, and they've got a quick start guide on their own website. So here we are on the website, and there's a very useful sort of getting started thing and bits to do. And one of the things I checked first was the radio, because what I need to have is at least OpenTX 2312. Now I updated to 2314. I had an earlier version on this particular radio, because you need CRSF shot, and if you recognise CRSF, it is of course the Crossfire protocol. Now ExpressLRS uses this to communicate between the transmitter and the TX, so this is all on the radio side. What it does over the airwaves I think is completely different, but yeah, so it's going to be quite familiar to many of us. So after I updated my radio, I set up a basic model which just had an external RF and CRSF, and then the other thing it mentions as far as the radio goes is getting the Lewis script, which you can get from this link here, or you can get it from the ExpressRLS configurator. There is a configurator here, and if you look here, there it tells you specifically where to download it, and there's versions for OSs, and that looks like this. But having installed that Lewis script, plugged my module in, what I wanted to know is what version of the firmware I currently had on it. And I noticed it said that once you get the Lewis script, you get this little figure here, and this, as it says here, is the commit hash of the firmware version that the module has. You can reference this hash from releases. So I wanted to just check that out before I did anything further. And here's my radio, and this is me going into the ExpressLRS Lewis script, definitely with one hand because I'm filming with the other. And you can see here that we get this 0BF0D9 reference to check out. And what I expected to find is that hash somewhere in the GitHub releases repository on one of these, but it wasn't, and I couldn't find it anywhere, and I was a bit flummoxed here. I mean, I figured I would probably update anyway, but I really wanted to know what that was. Fortunately, I talked to the Discord people, and they said, oh, it looks like this was just a fork that someone had updated, because it doesn't actually belong to any branch in this repository. And here it is here, the 0BF0D9, coming from link R09. And he seems to, I'm guessing he was doing some work specifically for BetaFPV, because he seems to have added specific stuff to that. And I'm guessing what happened is the code on that radio was actually built from that split, this link R01 master. So he had forked that, built it, put it on the module, and then they shipped that. So I still don't know what version it is, unfortunately. I guess if I was nitpicking so far, I'd say, hey, it'd be quite nice to have just a version number there rather than a git hash. But anyway, what this means is we really want to go ahead and flash a new version to the module anyway. And there's actually a couple of reasons we want to do that anyway. Firstly, I want to know how it works. Secondly, what you can do is set a specific bind phrase which will link your receivers and module. So let's sort this out. I see the BetaFPV 900 MHz is down here, and I want to flash the TX via Wi-Fi, and now we come up with a bunch of options. Helpfully enough, this is quite nicely done, so you just sort of float over here and it tells you stuff. So there are a couple of things that people might not recognize. We've got this thing called no sync on ARM, which you'd probably be doing if you're racing. This basically says leave it on, it lowers latency. And then you've got some interesting stuff like if you enable telemetry, you must have the next one on, which has hybrid switches 8. The way the switches work is very interesting. In order to keep latency down, what they've done is they've made the first 4 channels sort of full range channels, and then the other channels they're expecting switches on, so they haven't got that much resolution on them. Because if you're talking about like a 3 position switch, you don't need, like, 1,000 different ways of saying up, middle or down. So that's quite an interesting point, that. So the binding phrase is an interesting one. If you don't use a custom binding phrase, then you'd have to use what they call traditional binding, which is the old, I mean, it's different here. It's like turn off, plug in and unplug 3 times, and then it do a double blink, and then it's in bind mode, and then you can use the bind button on the Lua script and connect that way. If you've got a binding phrase in both the receiver and the module, it will just bind using that particular phrase. So it's kind of like, here's your password, and we'll just connect to something with that password, which I think is quite cool. So I'm going to go ahead and sort something out like that. Obviously, if you turned up and you had this phrase in your module and you wrote that, you'd be able to fly my stuff. So it's not super secret, I guess, unless you thought people were trying to take your things off, and I can always change this, but obviously have a unique phrase for your stuff. Anyway, let's try building that and see what happens. Alright, so now what I've got is some little binary firmware ready to flash. Happily enough, the documentation's been really good so far. I can see that there's a whole thing about how to flash my BetaFPV module, and it's pretty much a case of going in and saying we want to do a Wi-Fi update, and then we need to basically that module will run a hotspot, and then we should be able to go to a page where we can just chuck the firmware.bin file that we've just seen there. So let's try that out. Right, bear with me because I'm having to film with my phone here. So right, let's go and say we'd like Wi-Fi update, and then it says go to HTTP 10.0.0.1, which, if you don't know, is the 10 network is a Class A network, which is similar to the Class B 192.168 network, which you might be familiar with on your Wi-Fi network. Now, what I'm noticing most about this is when I go in and say Wi-Fi update, and it says go to HTTP 10.0.0.1. It then goes back, and I can't see the Wi-Fi network that should be appearing, which is called ExpressLRS. Okay, well I tried, but it just looked like it wasn't coming out with that hotspot. So the other method of flashing this is via the USB. So I've got this plugged in via USB-C. So we have to change the target. It has to be via UART instead of via Wi-Fi. The rest of it should all be the same. Let's do another build and flash, see what happens. Serial port, USB serial. Oh, this is different. We've got a flashing light on the module. So something must be going on. Nope. So it seems like the result should be we press this whilst holding down this button, and then we see what happens. And suddenly we're writing stuff. There might be some LEDs on, but I can't take my finger off the special button. This is ridiculous, but we have success. That's insane. Now the reason I knew about this is I talked to the guys on Discord again, a super helpful guy. They told me that Wes here, who's one of the developers, had received the same modules from BetaFPV, had the same problems, but he discovered this workaround. It's all about the module missing a 100 microfarad capacitor, which stopped the ESP32 chip being able to talk. Apparently it only happens on a handful of these, but it certainly happened on my one. So I'll be letting BetaFPV know. Wes has already told them, so hopefully that gets fixed. Anyway, we can finally move forwards. Okay, so here's the options for the RX, which I'm going to attempt to do via Wi-Fi. I'll do it in 2 stages, so I'm just going to build it and then we'll attempt to see if it goes onto the Wi-Fi network and we can do something with it. There's this thing called auto Wi-Fi on interval, and I don't know if it's been set on the receivers as it is. What it means is after 20 seconds, if there's no connection from a transmitter, it will go onto Wi-Fi, and at that point you can join the Wi-Fi network and push the update over. And this is a great way of never having to go and push the tiny button. So we'll try that and see what happens. We just have to pretty much hope that that's the case. Otherwise I think we can do something to put the Wi-Fi on. Anyway, let's build it. Okay, cool. So we've got a build there for the RX. Now let's go and turn the quad on. Okay, here's the quad, and rather than plug a big battery in, I'm just going to plug this power bank in via USB because it does power up the receiver. And what we're getting is a slow flash at the moment, and I'm hoping that after about 20 seconds we'll get this real rapid flashing, and that would mean it's gone onto a Wi-Fi mode. And hopefully I've talked for about 20 seconds about it and it's going to do it in a sec. Come on. Oh yeah, look at that. So real rapid flash there. So let's go back to the computer, see if we can get a Wi-Fi network for it, and then we can try and push it over. Okay, finally we got the ExpressLRS network up, and the range on these things is not much because I had it over on the other side of my office and I wasn't seeing it, and I've got it sat on my lap now, and I've only got sort of 2 out of the 4 possible bars. But as soon as you can connect to it and the password ExpressLRS, you can then connect via 10.0.0.1 on a web browser, and then we can basically chuck a file at it. So that's what I'm going to do next. I want to know if I can just drop a file here. Yes, I can. That's handy because that is so many subdirectories down. Right, let's try updating. It's all gone very quiet on the receiver. There's no flashing. Oh, update successful rebooting, it says. Okay, so I've got the radio powered on with the module there. So the idea is I should be able to power this up without having to bind it, and it just work. That's the whole idea of that bind phrase. So let's plug this in the USB again. So we have got a solid blue light, which I'm guessing means bound. That's good news, isn't it? No binding anymore. So the other thing I want to do in this, because I enable telemetry, is well, let's see what sensors we get if we go and find some. So telemetry. Here we go. At the moment we've got nothing there. So let's say discover new sensors. And we've got 10. So if we've got things like link quality, power, 100 milliwatts, receiver link quality maybe. I have to look up what these actually are. But yeah, we're certainly getting two-way communications from there. That's good news. Let's stop that discovery now. So we finally got the module and the receiver updated. They are bound together, although we didn't have to bind, we just had to have that bind phrase in the build. So now I can check out any special things about how we use them, because what I know about this is you've only got 4 high resolution channels, and that's pretty much going to be for your sticks, because obviously you need the full resolution, but you don't need the full resolution on a two-way switch. So I just need to find out, thank you, what we have to do in terms of that setup. And I have to get this into iNav anyway to do some sorting out of the flight controller and stuff. Okay, so what we're going to do now is set up our model, and I'm going to use iNav on this one, but it will be a very similar sort of situation with BetaFlight or many other things. And this is the thing I was talking about how they use their switches differently and how you've only got a certain amount of channels which have full resolution. So as I said, channels 1 to 4, your main sticks, have full resolution. Everything else has less so. And aux1, which they say you must have your ARM switch on, is literally a 1-bit 2-position switch. But the critical thing about it is that the position is sent every single packet, whereas the other ones have like a round robin frequency. So each channel isn't sent on every packet, but like they take it in turns. But because the ARM is so important, that's done every single packet. And if we have a look at how I've set up iNav here, it looks like this. So my receiver type is serial and it's on crossfire. I've got my radio connected here, as you can see, and you can see my switches moving, but they move very exactly. And what I did, I set one up on a potentiometer to show you what would happen. So we have a look at on screen at channel 10. You'd notice if you normally had this sort of rotary potentiometer, it would give you smooth movement on the channels. With this one, it's a 6 position, but it sort of gives 7 because you've got your start at 1000. So as we move around, I'm moving smoothly, it jumps to 1275, 1425, 1500, 1575, 1725 and 2000. That's it. So we've got a lot of space in between there we can't use. So this is a little bit of a problem for people wanting a nice smooth pan tilt. Now there's one exception to this, and this just tells you that your default is like a 2-position switch, but we use the hybrid switches 8 in our build options. And on aux8 we get a 16 position, which is, you know, not amazing as far as if you wanted something like a pan tilt, but better than nothing. Personally, I'd like it if you had an option of like another mode. You've got this, you've got hybrid switch 8. There should be something where you had more channels with more resolution, but perhaps, you know, you give up latency or you give up range or something like that, just for people that fly with a pan tilt, or they want to use certain things where they want full resolution. I mean, I was thinking of like flaps and crow braking. Flaps I think you can get away with just certain positions, but yeah, there's things that people want there, so it would be nice to have a different mode. Anyway, with all my channels set up and stuff, I'm just gonna set up my modes and get ready to fly this thing. The one final word of setup on either BetaFlight or iNav is stuff about the RSI and link quality, and this seems to do what Crossfire now does, which is it sort of sends the telemetry internally, so you don't kind of need to think about it. And what that means in iNav is that I have the RSSI channel as disabled, but then in my OSD I've set 3 things here, and iNav actually has a separate section for this under CRSF statistics. So I've got here, this is the RSI in dBm. I've got this one here, which is the link quality, and I've also put on the TX power in milliwatts. Not sure if that's supported, it didn't mention it in the website, but I thought we'll put it in there and we'll see what happens. Okay, so for testing the garden, it took me a little while just to figure out which way this compass was orientated. Kept going back and checking the goggles because it seemed different upstairs where I had a lot of equipment around, as it might be. That's now facing the right way, and this is how I've got the antenna. Always better to have vertically mounted if you can, and I've got plenty of space, I think, between the prop and that. Even if I was to do that, I couldn't reach it, so I think that's pretty safe like that. This quad was not easy to get flying because modern flight controllers expect faster response from ESCs, not PWM. But in the garden, we sort of got it like vaguely okay, and I thought, you know, that seems probably pretty good for what it is. So I figured that was enough to go out and test it in a bit more space. Looked quite smooth from the external camera, didn't it? But yeah, flying it was not that much fun. It was a bit breezier, and certainly up in the air this thing was wobbling around a lot. We'd spent quite a lot of time messing around with the tuning, trying to get it relatively smooth, but what looked good in a hover did not translate to going through the wind. You'll see we're jumping about all over the place here. It was not that much fun to fly. In terms of the radio, things seemed fine. The LQ stayed at 100. I did notice that our milliwatt didn't show up. We were at 100 milliwatts in this test, so that seemed to work okay. But yeah, this was the only FPV flight I did. I spent the rest of the time messing around with the tuning, and I actually landed this using RTH because I didn't want to land this FPV. I could have gone to line of sight and done it that way, but this seemed to work just as well. So yeah, that's the quite short version of the flight. I'll be back flying this some more because this is the quad I want to put an Open HD system on as well, so I need to swap this out, put a different camera on and put the Pi in there. But before I do that, I need to have this flying pretty smoothly because a digital camera is going to be even less tolerant of the wobbles. Now normally I would go out and do some more range testing and see how the whole thing worked, but this video is already 30 minutes long, a lot of which was involved in trying to overcome some of the problems. So I think I'll leave it here for this one, but obviously I'll be flying again with that quad as soon as I get it sorted out because it's, as I said, going to be my Open HD platform, but I need to get it nice and smooth so that digital camera will work, and then I can take that out and probably fly it. Now a couple of things I do need to correct since the start of this video. Can't be bothered to go back and edit the original stuff. I mentioned about saying, wow, how come these are so small when you compare it with like a Betaflight antenna? And this is because BetaFPV, it turns out, actually do several versions of this. So this one is not intended to be a full range one. This is like a 40, I think it's a 46 mil, there's like an 80 something mil. The idea of this one is it's not full range, it's intended for like toothpicks and whoops. That said, I think the range out of it will be reasonable, just not long range. They do the longer one, which is more akin to sort of the Crossfire type antenna, so I can always switch those over if I want to. But it'd be nice to work out exactly how far you can get with this as well. So overall, I'm liking the idea of ExpressLRS a lot. I just think that unfortunately the manufacturers, in this case this is a review of the BetaFPV stuff, are slightly lagging behind. Perhaps it's been rushed out a bit. There must be a concept of testing. So when you have a module which is like one of its main features is like update it over Wi-Fi and it simply doesn't work, that's pretty bad, isn't it? It's like how easy is that to test? And that's nothing to do with the fact that the USB on this particular one didn't work because of that missing capacitor. That's just odd. I spoke to BetaFPV about that, and they said less than 5% will be affected. Because what I want to know, if you were an affected one, could you return it and get a replacement? Because I know if I'd have paid and got a non-working thing, I don't think that's acceptable. I think I'd want to return it and get a working one. They haven't answered that question yet. When or if they do, I'll put the answer down below so you can do what you need to should you get a dodgy one. Hopefully they've all been sorted now and all the new ones will have this extra capacitor. But personally for me, I think it's unacceptable to have something that you have to take apart to flash it. I mean, you won't be flashing that often, but I think it should at least work. And I think that's the problem so far. It's not an ExpressLRS. ExpressLRS seems to be an awesome idea. You have open source code and hardware that basically stops receivers and modules being sort of bound to each other. You can have manufacturers from all over the place creating stuff that you'll be able to bind to with your single module, and hopefully not have to bind to it, because if you flash the firmware with your bind phrase on, the binding is a thing of the past, which is great stuff. The problem seems to be that there's no sort of certification to say, hey, this works perfectly with ExpressLRS. I would love ExpressLRS to do some sort of basic certification thing, just to say like a badge of like, yeah, this works. Like manufacturers all send them the stuff, say how it's supposed to work, and if it doesn't, sort of come back later when it's working, and if it does, they get a little badge of honour. So, I mean, this would have been rejected for not having Wi-Fi working. I think it's fine to release a product and say we will update it at a later stage to have this working, but there was nothing in the documentation about that. It should work. And they're not the only one. I got this module to review as well. This is from Namimno, I think that's how you say it. It's a 2.4 ELRS module. It's got a built-in fan so it can run very high power. Wi-Fi doesn't work on that one either. Please get it together, or at least give decent instructions about where you are in the development process, what works now, what doesn't work, and I think everybody will be a lot happier. But certainly I think ExpressLRS is something very interesting and you should definitely check it out. So I should thank BetaFPV for sending me this module and several of these receivers. I will be back flying things like this behemoth to get right, but I'm kind of into the ELRS ecosystem now. I've also got this Happy Model PP, which just has this tiny ceramic antenna, so there's no physical wire coming out of it. I think it's very interesting and there's a lot to look at there. So links down below for these products. Hope this has been useful. Sorry if it's been so long. Congratulations if you stay to the end, and I'll catch you next one. Bye for now. Well, you've made it to the end of the video, so thanks once again for watching. If you like what you saw, then please consider subscribing, and if you really like what you saw, then be sure to check out the link to my blog for a variety of ways in which you can help support this channel.